There is a shoebox in almost every American home built before 1980. It sits on the top shelf of a bedroom closet behind the winter blankets, and inside it is a tangle of old pins, flowers with missing stones, a plastic fox that looks like it came out of a cereal box, something gold-colored and heavy that turns your fingertips green. Most families, when they finally clear out that closet, do exactly what you would expect. They sweep the whole box into a bag and drop it at the donation center, and they feel a little guilty for even hesitating. But somewhere in the last 18 months, a woman in Ohio did hesitate. She was cleaning out her late mother's apartment, and she found a brooch shaped like an insect, enormous, easily the size of her palm, crusted in amber and green stones. It looked theatrical. It looked cheap. It was the exact kind of thing you would expect to find in a costume shop. She almost put it in the donation bag with everything else. Instead, on a whim, she photographed the back of it, and there was a name stamped into the metal that she had never heard of. That brooch sold at auction for $8,400. That is not a fluke. That is a pattern, and it is a pattern that repeats because of one very specific reason. For about 30 years, the entire American antiques market decided that brooches were worthless. Dealers would not buy them. Estate sale companies would not itemize them. They got thrown into what the trade calls the junk box, sold by the pound. And that collapse in demand is precisely why so many exceptional pieces are still sitting in ordinary houses today, unrecognized, because nobody ever bothered to look at the back. Today, we are going to look at 7 of them. 7 brooch makers whose work is routinely mistaken for garbage, whose pieces are quietly selling for hundreds and sometimes thousands of dollars, and whose names you have almost certainly never heard, even if you already own one. We are counting down from 7 to number 1, and number 1 is the $8,400 piece. Before we start, understand why brooches specifically got abandoned, because it explains everything that follows. Brooches went out of fashion in the late 1980s for a practical reason, not an aesthetic one. Clothing changed. Heavy structured jackets, wool coats, and dress suits with thick lapels disappeared from everyday wardrobes. A brooch needs fabric with body to hang correctly. Put a substantial pin on a thin knit top and it sags, it pulls, it puts a hole in the shoulder. So women stopped wearing them. And once women stopped wearing them, the resale value fell off a cliff. For nearly 3 decades, a brooch was the single least desirable thing you could find in a jewelry box. What almost nobody noticed is that the collectors never left. They just went quiet. And while the general public treated brooches as scrap, a small group of specialists kept buying the very best examples at prices that would shock you. Now, with vintage clothing back in fashion and a younger generation buying antique jewelry, that quiet collector market has become a loud one, and the supply is still sitting in shoeboxes. Let us start the countdown. Number 7. Lea Stein of Paris. If you have ever picked up a brooch that looked like a colorful plastic fox or a cat or a stylized woman's face made of layered stripes and thought that it belonged in a child's toy chest, you have very likely held a Lea Stein. These pieces genuinely do look like plastic. They are bright, they are flat, they are cheerful, and they have absolutely none of the sparkle that people associate with valuable jewelry. They are also made by a process that no other jewelry maker in the world used. Lea Stein, working in Paris with her husband, a chemist, developed a technique of layering thin sheets of cellulose acetate with fabric sandwiched between the layers, then baking the block and slicing it. That is why the colors seem to sit inside the material rather than on top of it, and why the surface has a faint depth to it when you tilt it toward a light. It is not paint. It cannot chip off because it was never on the surface to begin with. Here is the identification point that matters, and it is the single most useful thing in this entire segment. Turn the piece over. Authentic Lea Stein pieces have a distinctive V-shaped pin back, heat riveted directly onto the body of the brooch, and the pin back itself is stamped with her name and Paris. If the back has an ordinary glued-on bar pin, it is not hers. That rivet is the tell. There is a second tell worth knowing because it separates a good piece from an ordinary one. Hold the brooch at an angle against a lamp and look at the edge where the layers meet. On a well-made early piece, you can count the individual laminated bands, crisp and evenly spaced, sometimes 6 or 7 of them in a piece only a few millimeters thick. On later or lesser examples, those bands are thicker, fewer, and less precise. Collectors look at that edge before they look at anything else, and you can learn to read it in about 30 seconds. Her production ran through the 1970s, stopped, and then resumed in the late 1980s, and the earlier pieces are the ones collectors chase. Common designs from the later period trade in the double digits. The scarcer early figural designs, particularly certain animals and the Art Deco-style portrait pins, regularly move in the low to mid-hundreds. Not life-changing, but consider that these are the exact pieces most likely to be thrown directly in the bin because they look like plastic novelties. And they were made in enough quantity that a great many American households have one. Number 6. DeLizza and Elster. This one is different from every other name on this list, and it is different in a way that makes it uniquely likely to be sitting in your house right now unrecognized. DeLizza and Elster was not a brand, it was a manufacturer. From the late 1940s through the 1980s, this New Jersey firm produced enormous quantities of high-quality rhinestone jewelry that was then sold under other companies' names, or under no name at all. For one brief period in the late 1960s, they attached a paper hang tag reading Juliana to some of their output, and paper hang tags do not survive 60 years in a shoebox. The practical result is that almost every DeLizza and Elster brooch in existence today is completely unsigned, and unsigned to most people means worthless. That is the assumption that keeps these pieces cheap. Somebody looks at the back, sees no maker's mark, and concludes that it must be a nameless 5 and dime piece. So you have to identify it by construction instead, and the construction is unmistakable once you know what you are looking for. Look at how the rhinestones are set. DeLizza and Elster used open-backed stones, meaning you can see light passing through from behind, and around each setting you will typically find visible excess adhesive, small hardened puddles that collectors actually use as a positive identifier rather than a defect. Look for blackened, oxidized metal underneath, a finish the trade calls japanning, used to make the stones pop. Look for the S-shaped and figure-8-shaped connecting links if the piece is part of a set, and look for large, deliberately mismatched stone shapes crowded together, ovals against navettes against round chaitons, in a single piece. One more practical point. Because this firm supplied so many other companies, you will occasionally find a piece carrying somebody else's name that was, in fact, built in the DeLizza and Elster workshop. The construction gives it away regardless of what is stamped on the back, so do not stop looking the moment you see a familiar brand name, because the manufacturer and the label were frequently two entirely different businesses, and in this case, the manufacturer is the one collectors care about. Values here depend enormously on the design and on whether you can locate the matching pieces. A single brooch on its own typically sits in the low to mid-hundreds. But because these were made and sold as coordinated sets, if the matching bracelet and earrings are still in the same box, the value of the group is worth substantially more than the sum of its parts. That is worth knowing before you split a setup and sell the pieces separately. Number 5. Selro and Selini. Now we get into genuinely strange territory, and strange is exactly where the money hides. In the 1950s and 60s, a New York firm run by Paul Sellinger produced a line of jewelry unlike anything else on the American market. The signature pieces feature a molded face set into an ornate metal frame. Sometimes it is a serene face styled after East Asian theatrical masks. Sometimes it is a devil face, horned and grinning. Sometimes it is a stylized figure in an elaborate headdress. Around the face, the settings are packed with confetti lucite, thermoset plastic cabochons, and colored rhinestones, all in heavy gold-tone metal. To a modern eye, these pieces look bizarre. They look like something from a costume trunk. People inherit them and genuinely do not know what to make of them, and that reaction is precisely why they end up in donation bags. But there is a serious and long-established collector base for this work, and it is a base that competes hard for good examples. The marks to look for are Selro or Selini stamped on the reverse, though a significant proportion of the output was never marked at all. So once again, construction matters. The tells are the thermoset face itself, the distinctive chunky gold-tone frames, and the confetti lucite cabochons with metallic flecks suspended inside them. Individual face brooches in good condition, with no chips to the face and no missing stones, generally trade in the mid-hundreds. Complete matching sets, and particularly the more unusual devil face and warrior designs, climb well beyond that. Condition matters more here than with almost anything else on this list, because the thermoset faces are the fragile element and a chipped face cuts the value dramatically. Number 4. Reja. Reja is a name that even a lot of casual vintage jewelry sellers cannot identify, and that is remarkable given how good the work is. The firm operated from the late 1930s into the early 1950s. It began under a different name and became Reja in the early 40s following a trademark dispute. What makes Reja significant is the timing. Its best output landed squarely in the Second World War years, and the war changed American costume jewelry in a way that is directly relevant to your shoebox. When the United States entered the war, base metals were redirected to military production. Manufacturers who wanted to keep making jewelry had to find a substitute, and the substitute they turned to was sterling silver, which was not restricted. So for a few years in the middle of the 1940s, a whole category of American costume jewelry was made in solid sterling and then plated in a warm gold wash, a finish called vermeil. This creates a very particular kind of hidden value. The piece looks like ordinary gold-tone costume jewelry. It has that yellow, slightly worn, mass-produced appearance. But it is sterling silver underneath, and it was made during a narrow window that is never repeated. Reja specialized in figural work during exactly this period. Birds, insects, flowers, animals, exotic dancing figures, all rendered with real sculptural detail. Check the reverse for the word Reja and check for the word sterling stamped alongside it, because that combination is what you want. Values for the standard floral and bird designs sit in the low hundreds. The more inventive figural designs, the ones with real character and movement, run considerably higher, and the very best examples reach into the 4 figures. Number 3. Stanley Hagler, New York City. Stanley Hagler built his reputation on a technique rather than a look, and the technique is the reason his work commands what it does. Hagler pieces are hand-assembled. Individual glass beads, often Venetian, sometimes seed pearls, are wired one at a time onto a filigree base with fine brass wire, building up layers until the piece has genuine 3-dimensional depth. Nothing is glued into a stamped setting. The base metal is a distinctive brass alloy that he plated in a soft, warm tone that does not tarnish the way ordinary costume metal does, and that resistance to tarnishing is itself a clue. The reason his brooches get overlooked is that from the front they can read as ornate and old-fashioned, the sort of large floral pin people associate with a grandmother's Sunday coat. They are large, they are elaborate, they do not photograph well on a phone, and to somebody who does not know the name, they simply look like a big old flower pin. The mark is an oval plaque on the reverse reading Stanley Hagler, NYC. There is an important dating point attached to that mark. From the mid-1980s onward, he worked alongside a co-designer, and pieces from that later collaboration carry both names on the plaque. Both are authentic, but the earlier single-name pieces are the ones that tend to command more. If you find one, resist the urge to clean it. The wire wrapping that holds the entire piece together is fine, and it work hardens with age. Aggressive cleaning, and especially ultrasonic cleaning, snaps those wires and turns a valuable brooch into a pile of loose beads. Values for typical examples sit in the mid-hundreds, and the large, complex, densely built pieces move well past that. Number 2. Nettie Rosenstein. Nettie Rosenstein was a serious American fashion designer first and a jewelry maker second, and that order matters because it explains the quality difference you can feel the moment you pick one of her pieces up. She dressed some of the most photographed women in mid-century America, and she designed jewelry to accompany her own clothing rather than as a standalone commercial product. That meant lower production numbers, better materials, and design decisions made by someone thinking about how a piece would sit on a specific garment rather than how cheaply it could be stamped out. Like Reja, her most collectible work comes out of the wartime sterling period, and the same logic applies. What appears to be an ordinary gold-toned pin is frequently sterling silver with a gold wash. Her figural animals and her large floral sprays are the pieces to look for, and the detail work on them is genuinely fine. Petals are individually shaped. Animal forms have modeled musculature rather than flat stamped outlines. The mark reads Nettie Rosenstein, and on the wartime pieces you will usually find sterling stamped nearby. Here is the practical warning. Her mark is often placed on a small applied plaque or along an edge rather than in the center of the back, and it is easy to miss entirely on a piece that is darkened with age. Before you write off any heavy old gold-toned brooch, turn it under a strong light and check the edges and the underside of any moving part. Good examples run from the mid-hundreds into 4 figures. Complete sets and the more sculptural figural pieces go higher still, and that brings us to number 1. Number 1. Iradj Moini. If you have been waiting for the $8,400 brooch, this is the name. Iradj Moini is an Iranian-born designer who worked in New York and spent formative years designing for one of the biggest names in American fashion before establishing his own practice. His brooches are unlike anything else discussed today, and the difference is scale. These are not lapel pins. They are sculptures. A Moini insect brooch can span the width of a hand. The forms are dramatic and often unsettling. Spiders, beetles, dragonflies, lizards, exotic fruits, human figures, built up from large semi-precious stones, rock crystal, and colored glass, all hand-wired rather than cast into a mold. And here is the cruel irony that makes this the single most misidentified piece on the list. Because they are so large and so theatrical, the average person's immediate reaction to a Moini brooch is that it must be a costume prop. It is too big to be real. Nobody, the reasoning goes, would put this many stones into something you actually wear. So it gets dismissed on sight, exactly the way the woman in Ohio nearly dismissed hers. The mark is his name, Iradj Moini, or in some cases simply the initials, and it is usually on a small applied plate on the reverse. Because the pieces are hand-assembled, no two are precisely identical, and that individuality is part of what the market pays for. Standard pieces move comfortably in the high hundreds to low thousands. The large, complex, exhibition-scale figural work is where the serious money is, and the strongest documented examples have crossed into 5 figures at specialist auction. The $8,400 sale we opened with sights in that upper band, it was a large figural piece in original condition with every stone intact. That last part deserves emphasis because it applies to everything on this list. Condition drives value more than almost any other single factor in vintage brooches. A missing stone in a visible position can cut a piece's value by half or more because replacements in the correct period glass are difficult and often impossible to source. Which leads to the most important practical advice in this entire video. If you find something you think might be significant, do not repair it, do not replate it, and do not clean it with anything stronger than a soft, dry cloth. Amateur repair has destroyed more value in this market than damage ever has. So let us bring this back to that shoebox on the closet shelf. 7 names. Lea Stein, whose pieces look like plastic toys and are anything but. DeLizza and Elster, whose work is almost never signed and has to be read through its construction. Selro and Selini, whose strange molded faces get mistaken for costume props. Reja, whose wartime figurals hide sterling silver under a gold wash. Stanley Hagler, whose hand-wired brooches read as ordinary grandmother's flowers until you find the oval plaque. Nettie Rosenstein, a real fashion designer whose mark hides along the edges, and Iradj Moini, whose brooches are dismissed for being too spectacular to be genuine. Every single one of those makers produced work that is regularly, routinely thrown away in this country. Not because the pieces are worn out, but because for 30 years we all agreed that brooches did not matter, and an entire generation never learned to look at the back. So, look at the back. Take the box down. Take each piece to a window in good daylight, turn it over, and read whatever is stamped there, even if the name means nothing to you. Photograph it. Write it down. The single most valuable habit in this entire field is refusing to make a judgment about a piece of jewelry based on how it looks from the front. And if you do find one of these names on something in your family's collection, Take your time, get it looked at properly before you sell it, and get more than one opinion, because the gap between what a general dealer will offer you and what a specialist buyer will pay is often the difference between $100 and several thousand. That box has been sitting there for 40 years. It can wait another week while you find out what is actually in it.